you know, the thought is we have taken time, we've gone slowly through this stuff when we covered it the first time. When I do a review session, I'm trying to pack in as much as I can in a period. And so, you know, you need to know that I am integrating this. You can replay and stop and pause the integrity recording if you want to, you know. So it'll be there for you. Well, St. Anselm, we said in the Middle Ages, came out with this totally new argument for God's existence. Nobody had thought of it before. Now, there were versions of, like, the design argument, but especially the argument for first cause. Even Aristotle used some arguments like that to try to prove the existence of a God he called the prime mover, which was a much more aloof, distant God than the God of traditional Judeo-Christian theism, which underscores a point that Hume makes, that the design argument can have more than one conclusion. For people like Paley or Aquinas, there is only one real conclusion. There is only one God out there who has a chance of existing, and that's the God of traditional monotheism. It's interesting, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, the word that the ancient Israelites used to refer to the religions of the nations surrounding them in Egypt and Mesopotamia and places like that is atheoi, from which we get the word atheist. In other words, but you can say, well, wait a second, they weren't atheists. They had these polytheistic systems. They had many gods they worshipped. How come you're calling them atheists? Well, you know, to the ancient Israelites, none of those gods existed. So they may as well have been atheists. They didn't have a God because they didn't have the only true God. You know, so for somebody like Aquinas or Anselm, I'm sorry, or Aquinas or Paley. The God of traditional Judeo-Christian monotheism is really the only option out there. But if you're only going from the argument itself, the design argument, Hume very correctly points out that the design argument can have many conclusions that are equally justifiable from the premises. The conclusion that the designer of the world is one is not even a unique conclusion. You could conclude from the design argument that the world was designed, the universe was designed by a committee. You could conclude that the designer of the universe was some lesser God or some infant God or some senile old God. You know, Hume tries to say that there are a number of different conclusions, and so it does not uniquely prove the God of monotheism. Now, I think the interesting thing to me, by contrast, and for that matter, neither does the argument from first cause, the cosmological argument. You know, Aristotle used it to try to prove the existence of his prime mover, who is a lot closer to the distant force of Star Wars than to the God of traditional monotheism. The interesting thing to me about the ontological argument is, if it does work, it seems to prove the existence of a God who fits pretty much the concept of God of traditional monotheism. So Anselm comes out with this, and it is an argument a priori. A priori, again, means prior to and independent of experience. Of the arguments listed below that in the review sheet, the ontological argument is the only one that is a priori, because it's working from an abstract concept of who God is, of God's being, hence the word hoantos, the Greek word for being or existence. Ontology is the branch of philosophy dealing with existence at its most fundamental level. What Aristotle called being qua being. So the ontological argument gets off the ground from nothing but an abstract concept of God. It does not use any observations about the world and its premises. And, to remind you about Descartes, when we look at him, he needs an a priori argument because at the point where he tries to prove God's existence, the only proposition he knows is absolutely certain is the I think, therefore I am. In other words, the only thing Descartes can prove as a philosopher is that he exists. So if he's going to prove the existence of God, he needs an argument that does not depend on observations about the world, as the other arguments are, because at that stage of the game, Descartes can't even defend philosophically the existence of the world. So the cosmological arguments, arguments that say that God must be around as a first cause of the cosmos, of the universe, of the world, those are a posteriori. They depend on observations about how things cause each other in the natural world around us to get going, right? And then argue back from that to a first cause. Design arguments, the teleological argument, depends. There's some in that folder. If somebody came in, you want to pick up a copy of it, do that. The teleological argument or design argument is also, that's from the previous class. You just signed the one for the 10 o'clock class. That's why you shouldn't go onto the teacher's desk without his permission. You might do the wrong thing. All right. So here's the thing. So cosmological and teleological arguments are a posteriori. In other words, a posteriori means after and dependent upon experience. They depend on observations about the world to get them going. The a priori arguments do not. They go from abstract concepts. So why is the ontological argument called that? Well, again, hoantos is a Greek word for being or existence. And the argument starts out with an abstract concept of who God is, of God's being with a capital B. And so what is the concept that Anselm uses? I'm going through the thing. Well, it's the concept of God as that than which none greater can be thought. In other words, as the greatest being we can think of or imagine. And so Anselm believes that it follows from thinking of God this way that the God who fits that concept has to exist in reality and not just as a concept in the mind. And so how does that follow? Well, first of all, who's the denier of God's existence? Who is the fool? And again, he's quoting Scripture here. The verse in the Psalm that says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." So the fool here is the person who denies God's existence, or who basically says, well, okay, God exists as a concept in the mind. I can think of God, but God does not exist in reality. But the ontological argument has going on underneath it in the background some Platonic assumptions about existence. Remember, for Plato, something that exists is greater than something that doesn't, and there are degrees of existence. The forms are greater than, the form of a table or tableness is greater than particular tables for Plato, but it also has a greater degree of existence. But so do particular tables in this world, the objects that are carried in front of the fire. They have a greater existence than their shadows or a picture of them or a concept in the mind of them, right? So to exist in reality is greater than existing as a shadow or as a concept in the mind. A table that exists in reality is greater than its shadow or greater than a concept of it that exists only in the mind and not in reality. So he says, what is the claim of the fool? The claim of the fool is that God exists only as a concept in the mind, but not in reality. So if the fool accepts Anselm's definition of God as that than which none greater can be thought, what else does he have to accept? Well, he basically has to buy into the conclusion that the being that fits that concept must exist in reality, not just as a concept in the mind. Again, going back to these Platonic reasons. So, if the denier of God says, okay, Anselm, I don't believe God is out there. I don't believe God exists in reality. But you know what, Anselm, I'll agree that if God did exist, God would be that than which none greater can be thought, the greatest being we can think of. I just don't think that that God exists in reality. And Anselm would say, well, wait a second. If that God did not exist in reality, then we could think of a greater being, a being that existed in reality as well as a concept in the mind. So basically, in order to qualify as the greatest being we can think of, since greatness and existence are tied together, the greatest being we can think of has to exist in reality, or else there would be a greater being we could think of. He wouldn't be the greatest being. As one of my old professors in grad school used to put it, if somebody says, well, I have a concept of God, and Anselm will say, well, does that God exist in reality? They'd say, no. Well, he said, whatever concept you have, it's not that than which none greater can be thought. So here's how the contradiction arises for the unbeliever, right? You can't buy in to the concept of God as that than which none greater can be thought and deny God's existence without contradicting yourself, because in order for something to qualify as the greatest being we can think of, as that than which none greater can be thought, it has to exist in reality and not just as a concept in the mind. So you can't say, okay, Anselm, I agree with you that God, if God existed, would be that than which none greater can be thought. but I don't believe that God exists in reality. And some would say, no, in order to qualify as that, he has to exist in reality. So for you to say, I agree, God is that than which none greater can be thought, but doesn't exist in reality, you're contradicting yourself. You have to give up the concept. And so, so necessarily then, if God falls under that description, God has to exist in reality. And so he proves the existence of God. Now, again, it's important to see that one's devoutness does not necessarily mean that one accepts every possible claim by somebody that they have an argument that proves God's existence. Uh-huh. Yeah, right, he has to do two things. One, by the concept of God as that than which none greater can be thought. Say, okay, if God existed, God would have that concept, and then at the same time deny God's existence. And Anselm is going to say, but wait a second, in order to qualify as that than which none greater can be thought, God has to exist. So you're saying both that God exists and God doesn't exist, and that's a contradiction. So the fool has to buy into the concept that Anselm is giving him, that God is the greatest being we can think of. And as I said, in the context that he's writing in, where he's basically in the Middle Ages in a Roman Catholic country, that is the concept of God that the ordinary man or woman out there on the street running a shop or farming or whatever is going to buy into, right? Now, in our more pluralistic society, I mean, I'm riding down on the light rail, and I got two East Indian gentlemen sitting across from me, probably, you know, maybe stereotypical computer geeks or engineers. At least they look like that, right? And maybe they're Hindus or Sikhs or something, you know. I have an obviously Islamic couple sitting down there. You know, you're not going to have, in our pluralistic society, everybody you meet on the street buying into the same notion of God. But in Anselm's day, he could pretty much assume that somebody who denied God's existence would probably accept the traditional concept of God in Judeo-Christian, and I guess you could include Islamic monotheism. So yeah, you have to do two things. You have to agree on Anselm with the concept of God he's using, and then deny God's existence. And then he'll come back and say, but in order to buy that concept, you've already bought into the claim that God exists. So you're, because God has to exist in reality to qualify as the greatest being we can think of, right? And so you'd contradict yourself. So does that help? Can you see? So anyway, now, so if the fool accepts Anselm's definition of God, what Anselm would say is, in order to be logically consistent, he also has to accept the conclusion that God exists in reality and not just as a concept in the mind. But now, Guanillo was a fellow monk, not an atheist, not an agnostic, and he thought that the argument did not work. In other words, it's one thing to believe or not believe in God. It's another thing to agree with somebody that a particular argument that they say proves God's existence, that argument really does the job. And so Guanillo is presumably as devout a believer as Anselm, but he does not think Anselm's argument works. And he uses a strategy that we teach even today in logic. We call it refutation by logical analogy. A regular analogy, like the design argument, compares two things. A logical analogy compares the abstract structure of two arguments. This is why we're not going to go into that in any detail, because we need to give you a lot of logical background in order to kind of see. But what you do, and remember, these medieval monks were very good at logic. They broke some new ground in logic at the time. The point is, what you do is you try to develop an argument that in its logical structure is parallel to, basically has the same structure. And in logic, arguments are good or bad depending on their structure. That's why there is an abstract subject called logic, that we can analyze arguments and set on the side what they're about. We don't care what they're about. We can use P's and Q's and R's. But is the structure of the argument good? Well, the point is, Guanillo says, why couldn't I use the same structure, an argument using the same logical structure, Anselm, as you're using, and prove something like the existence of the most perfect island? Prove that it's got to be out there from mere concepts alone. Now, suppose somebody discovered a new island. Suppose they just started putting satellites in the sky. Or hundreds of years ago, Magellan or some seafaring adventurer first discovers an island that nobody knew existed. And they said, well, here, we've seen it with our own two eyes. Or we put up this new satellite, and it's taking pictures of remote ocean parts of the earth that nobody has ever seen before, and lo and behold, there's an island out there in the middle of maybe the Indian Ocean or something that nobody had seen before. And we've got the proof because we got satellite photos. Well, that would be a reasonable way to prove that the island's there, right? They were trying to prove that the plane wreckage was there, by first taking photos from space and then going and investigating them. But the point is, wouldn't it seem odd, though, that somehow I could prove that the most, not just any old island, but the most perfect island I could imagine or think of? And you saw my slides. When I think of one, I don't think of a barren volcanic island. I think of a lush tropical paradise, right? Wouldn't it seem odd that from the mere concept of such an island, I could prove logically that it has to be out there somewhere? You'd say, look, you don't have any other evidence to go on, just the concept of it, and you say, I have to buy the conclusion that it's there. There's something wrong about that. And so the strategy of developing a logical analogy is you develop a parallel argument that either proves something questionable or absurd or even contradictory to the original argument, and you say, but wait a second, you're using the same reasoning, and if there's something wrong with my parallel argument, there's something wrong with the original. And so Guanillo knows that you should not be able to prove that the most perfect island is out there just from the abstract concept of it. Guanillo knows that, but he says, look, if I can't do that, you're using the same reasoning to prove that God must be there just from the abstract concept of God as the most perfect being we can think of or imagine. So there must be something wrong with your reasoning. Both of them should not work. We shouldn't be able to prove that the most perfect island is out there from the mere concept of it. We shouldn't be able to prove that God has to be there in reality from the mere concept of God, says Guanillo. Not Descartes, but Anselm's reply has never been very satisfying to me. But his reply basically is that the case of God is unique when we're talking existence. Now, in ways you can sort of think of this, right? I mean, we have Moses, Charlton Heston. Later, Moses was the head of the National Rifle Association. I actually saw Charlton Heston speak for about 2 hours. He gave a show at the University of Virginia that I attended. It was actually kind of neat. But the point is, Moses is up there on the mountain, and God's dictating the 10 Commandments to him and writing these things in stone. And Moses says, hey, look, those people down there, I mean, do you have a name? Those people down there are going to ask, who's commanding them to do all this stuff? What am I going to give them for a name? And you know the famous quote, right? The biblical quote is what later was called the Tetragrammaton, right? He says, well, you go down there and tell them I am has sent you, that I'm the God who actually exists, is what he's saying. Those other gods are just figments in people's imagination. Go down there and tell them I exist has sent you. And so there's a biblical tradition for what Descartes wants to claim. And that is that the concept of existence is somehow unique in a way to God's existence in a way that it isn't to the existence of the most perfect island. And that's Anselm's reply to Guanillo. So Anselm basically says that because existence works, is fundamental to God in a way that it's not fundamental to the most perfect island, Guanillo's point doesn't work, that he can prove the existence of God from the concept of God, but not the existence of the most perfect island. Well, frankly, if you're buying into the same Platonic assumptions in the background, I don't think that reply works. Pardon? Well, right. I mean, that's kind of his point, that existence is somehow fundamental to God's nature in the way that it's not fundamental to the nature of the most perfect island. So he's saying you can use the ontological argument to prove God's existence, but Guanillo, you're wrong. You can't use it to prove the existence of the most perfect island, so your analogy does not work. But and Descartes runs with this idea of existence being fundamental to the concept of God by saying that existence is as fundamental to who God is as having 3 sides and 3 angles is fundamental to what a triangle is. I mean, it's not essential that a triangle be colored pink or blue or red or orange or any color, right? It's not necessary to a triangle being a triangle that it be any particular color. But it is essential and necessary for a geometric figure to be a triangle that it have 3 angles and 3 sides. So having 3 angles is fundamental to something's being a triangle. And Descartes says, in the same way, existence is fundamental to who God is. So Descartes, the concept of God's being that Descartes uses is that God is the most perfect being. God has all perfect qualities. And what he's going to try to show is that existence is one of those perfect qualities. And so the concept of God that he works with is pretty much the traditional concept of God as having the traditional attributes of God. God is omnipotent, all-powerful. God is omniscient, all-knowing. I list these in the PowerPoint slides. God is omnipresent, everywhere. God is omnibenevolent, merciful, and morally perfect. But Descartes says you need to add to this list that God exists. God possesses existence as one of these perfect properties. So what happens then when you add existence to the description of God? Then you're saying, well, the concept of God is that God is the most perfect being. God has all perfect qualities. Existence is one of those qualities. So in order to be the most perfect being, God has to exist in reality and not just as a mental concept. So here again, the fool, the denier of God, would contradict himself, according to Descartes, if he said, well, okay, Descartes, I will agree. I don't believe God exists in reality. I don't believe God's out there, but I'll agree with you on the concept of God as the most perfect being. If God were around, God would be the most perfect being. But then Descartes would say, but wait a second. If we agree that God's the most perfect being, wouldn't you agree that that means God possesses all perfect qualities? And he says, yes, but Descartes would say, well, wait a second. Existence is one of those perfect qualities, existence in reality. So in agreeing that God possesses all perfections, or is the most perfect being, you've also agreed that God exists in reality, so you would contradict yourself as the non-believer, as the fool, to say, I agree with you, Descartes, on the concept of God as the sum of all perfections, as the most perfect being, but I deny that God exists in reality, because in buying into the concept that God is the most perfect being, Descartes is going to try to show you that you've also bought into God's real existence. So, what is the traditional reply to this? Now again, Immanuel Kant comes from a German Lutheran Protestant tradition. He believes in God. In fact, he makes his own argument that God has to be around and be real in order for morality to make any sense. So Kant is not an atheist, but he didn't think the ontological argument worked. Why? Because Okay, well, basically, Descartes makes existence to be what logicians call a logical predicate. If I predicate something of something else, I'm saying it has a particular property. In other words, if I predicate being black of this briefcase, if I say the briefcase is black, then I'm saying that it has that particular quality. If I say the briefcase is soft, I'm predicating softness of the briefcase. Likewise, if I say God is omnipotent, I'm predicating omnipotence of God. If I say God is all-knowing, omniscient, I'm saying God has that property. right? And Descartes makes existence to be a property of God. Along with God's being omniscient and having the other properties, God is an existing being. God exists. Kant says that's not how existence functions. Existence is not a logical predicate. It is not a property something has, that it exists. But something has to exist to have any properties. Existence is a precondition of a thing's having any properties, but existence itself is not a property. In other words, this briefcase here would have to exist for it to have any other properties, being soft, being black, being heavy, whatever. But existence is not a property of the briefcase. And so, if you take existence out of the list of God's perfections, then you can agree that God has all perfect qualities and deny God's existence in reality without contradicting yourself, because existence is no longer in the list of God's perfections. And Kant says, look, it's true that in order for me to conceive of a figure that's a triangle, I have to conceive of it necessarily as having three angles. But if I say there is no triangle over there on that whiteboard, I reject the triangle with all of its properties. And likewise, Kant said we can deny God's existence without falling into contradictions. Descartes is wrong. The argument doesn't absolutely prove God's existence, the ontological argument, because existence is not a logical predicate. Now, in the 60s, Alvin Plantinga, who was then at Calvin College, now at Notre Dame, developed an argument, a version of the ontological argument that does not depend on taking existence as a logical predicate. He showed that using very high-powered logic, and just to describe this in ordinary English, common sense language, you can go from a statement that says it's possible that a necessary being exists. God is, of course, the necessary being you have in mind, right? You can go from it is possible that a necessary being exists, and in modal logic, you can go through justifiable steps, like you'd prove a proof in geometry, and you can end up with the conclusion that it's necessary that a necessary being exists. That is, that there's no way a necessary being cannot exist. And so, in other words, you could picture the denier of God saying, well, I don't believe such a necessary being is around, but I'll grant you this, that it's at least possible that such a necessary being is around. And then Alvin Plantinga would say, but I've got a detailed proof that shows you that if you think it's even possible, that it's also necessary, that in every conceivable situation, a necessary being has to exist. So, okay. So that reopened the discussion because it did not depend. Well, Aquinas, we've done this stuff recently. The design argument is called the teleological argument because of telos. It goes from the assumption that things in the world have purposes. Again, you want to review the criticisms of the design argument. It's a major oversight. I neglected to put that in the review sheet, but I guarantee you there will be some questions on Hume on the design argument. So review that PowerPoint, or print it out for yourself. So at any rate, The fifth way is the design argument. The first three are the cosmological argument. We're not worried about them. But Aquinas says, look, something without understanding, without intelligence, cannot be goal-directed by itself. Even an unintelligent arrow that lacks intelligence or understanding has to be directed toward its target by an intelligent author. Not author, but archer. Likewise, Paley says what made the watch different from the stone might have been there for thousands of years, might have been made by entirely natural forces. What made the watch different is it had a series of intricate parts that worked together toward a purpose, a function. And the idea is the watch, unlike the stone, could not have gotten there by merely natural forces. The watch needed a designer. So similarly, Paley says something like the eye also has, like the watch, intricate parts that work together to serve a purpose. So it's an argument from analogy. You're saying two things are alike in some respects, therefore they ought to be alike in a further respect. So if the watch needed a designer to design it so that those parts work together for that function or purpose, telos is a purpose. So something in nature like the eye, says Paley, needed a designer to design it to fulfill that purpose. Now, of course, the alternative story of evolution is that natural forces using adaptation to their environment and millions of years of time and natural selection, you can have more and more complex eyes developing from entirely random natural forces over time to where you get our eyes. So, that's the alternative story that evolution tells. Of course, my problem with evolutionary theory since high school is how do you even get the first cell of DNA, by entirely random forces, because the odds against that are astronomical. Once you get self-replication going and animals sophisticated enough to adapt to their environment, yeah, you got a nice evolutionary argument, but how do you get the first cell of DNA? That's always been my intellectual hurdle with evolution as an entirely random process. I do believe there was evolution. I don't believe the Earth is only 6,000 years old, but I think you needed more than that. But that's my own. You don't have to agree with me, by the way. Remember, your essays are not graded on whether or not you take a position I agree with. They're graded on traditional things like how well written they are. Is the grammar good? Do you try to address all the details, all the topics of the question? Are you on point? And how detailed is it? How accurate are you? Do you understand what you're writing on? Not on whether or not you're taking a position that I happen to agree with. Okay? And I still don't know about the ontological argument, even Alvin Plantinga's thing. I had a beer with Alvin Plantinga over there in Scotland in 1995 when we were there for a different conference. But I still don't. I have my doubts about the system of logic in which you can make that proof. And so I have my doubts about even Plantinga's version of it, although Plantinga himself was a nice fellow. and probably the number one Christian philosopher in the nation, both then and maybe now. Anyway, okay, bring a number 2 pencil, buy your Scantron, get your essay in on time Friday, and we'll see you Friday. So have a good day. Take care. And remember, you can use any printouts of any PowerPoints, any notes you have. No electronics, though. They're just too smart. So no laptops, no iPads or Pods or anything like that. Nothing with an eye in front of it, right, except your own eye. Yeah, did you have a... Yeah, all of them are online. They're in a separate folder in Blackboard that's labeled PowerPoints. Those folders are in course documents. So, in a well, okay. So if you go to course documents and then PowerPoints, okay. Now some of these, okay. Meditation by Descartes and the ontological argument. This also has the fifth way in it. We already covered these in test 1, but you need Hume's criticisms of the design argument as well. That's the one that I didn't get down. So 3 of them. You need this one, and this one.
And then everything on there is going to be on the test, or everything on the test is you can find in there.
Yeah, if you haven't done a lot of reading in the book, definitely concentrate on those 3 PowerPoints, and that would be enough to help you to do well. You know, especially if you're short of time, you'd be much more productive. But you want to print them out since you can refer to them. You know, so yeah. Oh, let me stop. I still have this thing recording away.